Today on the Handling Solo Wine channel, we are exploring the wine ward of the Groenekloof, and we're using the rather stellar Samesyn Verdelho as a sensory aid from which to trigger our theoretical musings. Incidentally, it's probably worth noting that if you enjoy drinking wine and pondering theoretical musings, or if you just want to stay up to date with South African wine history, wine science, and unusual cultivars, then join the Handling Solo Wine Club and subscribe to our YouTube channel where there are almost 400 wine videos just like this one. And give us a like because it helps more people like you to find our content. Some might argue that Cloof Estate in the Groenekloof ward is most famous for being the host of the Rocking the Daisies festival, which will have its 20-year anniversary in 2025. More wine-oriented minds may argue that it was in fact Cloof Estate's Ducat Red Blend that won a whole bunch of double golds and beat out wines that were 3 times the price in a few wine competitions roughly 10 years ago. But whether it's the music festival or wines that dramatically over-deliver on their price point, it is beyond dispute that Cloof Estate has been a stalwart of the Groenekloof wine ward for at least 2 generations. Now, if we shift our focus to the more premium end of the South African wine scale, it was probably the producer Neil Ellis who has been shouting the merits and glories of the Groenekloof ward the longest and has produced some really rather fascinating wines from cultivars like Cinsault, Syrah, and Sauvignon Blanc, all of which are well worth exploring. The Groenekloof ward is situated on the west coast of the African continent, way down south, sitting in the middle of the Darling Wine District. This ward features the rather enviable combination of being really very close to the freezing cold Atlantic Ocean on the west coast. It also has slight elevation, putting it right in the path of some really rather extreme offshore winds coming off said cold Atlantic Ocean. And lastly, the vineyards that produce the fruit for this wine were farmed by Charles Ducat in some rather dramatic red iron-rich granitic soils. So these elements make Groenekloof ward a rather fascinating place to grow vines. For the most part, the Groenekloof wines that have been turning heads have usually been made from cultivars like Syrah and Sauvignon Blanc. But as I mentioned earlier, this seems to be a ward that refuses to be boxed in and has produced some really interesting wines from a number of different cultivars and styles. Verdelho with an H is a Portuguese cultivar, which is not at all to be confused with Verdelho double L or Verdelho with a G. Those are different grapes entirely. Verdelho is an increasingly popular choice amongst some of South Africa's more progressive vignerons, not only because the grape is extremely drought resistant, but also because it manages to retain an enviably high level of natural acidity. These 2 factors make it a regular on the list of South African climate change cultivars that any self-respecting grape hunter or wine geek will be sampling as often as they can. But admittedly, it does take more than just enviably high levels of natural acidity in order to make a great wine. So let's get into the glass and see what else awaits us. Now, when we give this guy a sniff, well, there's a whole lot going on. It's quite a generous nose on the one hand with fruit components of really very vivid apricot fruit and also some tropical pineapple, but then there are kind of saltier, more savory, flinty, reductive Riverstone type notes as well. Both these categories are followed up by softer, sweeter elements of perhaps vanilla custard and caramelized pear. Of course, when you look at how this wine was made, it's fascinating to note that there were 2 parcels fermented separately. One was barrel fermented and the other was fermented in stainless steel tank. The stainless steel tank is starved of oxygen, made very protectively in a reductive environment. And so that preserves the really fresh, vibrant fruit elements like that apricot we mentioned, but it also delivers the slightly more stony, salty, flinty, smoky, reductive compounds that we mentioned on the nose. The oak component or the barrel component does the opposite. There's a little more oxygen allowed into the wine, and also the barrel itself imparts levels of vanillins and lactones. That's where your notes like custard or caramelized pear might come from. But then oxygen also plays a role in sometimes delivering some slightly more complex, less fruit-oriented, more savory and nutty notes. Now, when we give this guy a sip, well, the immediate impression is just some insanely fresh, bright, citric acidity that just runs down the middle like a laser light. And then wrapped around that, there are slightly sweeter elements, some of those pineapple and stone fruit elements that we spoke about on the aromas. There's even a bit of pear fruit. All of it is just so concentrated. The texture is no slouch either. I spent a lot of time talking about chalky tannins on red wine, but in this particular one, it actually feels like someone has sprinkled a little bit of chalk dust into the glass. And at that point, any rational human would say, well, that sounds ridiculous. Who wants to drink chalk dust? And I say, to hell with rationality. Anyway, that's all we have time for today, but I have left links to 2 videos. One covers the De Krantz Tritonia Verdelho, which will give you a little bit of a history on Verdelho around the world and where it's come from. And the other video covers a white blend made by De Kleine Veen. And in this video, I really go super deep onto both the ampelographical and linguistical history of Verdelho.